In the remote hollows of southeastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like ghostly fingers, there exists a valley that locals refuse to name. Maps from the 1800s show it clearly marked as Thornfield Valley, but by 1920, cartographers had begun leaving it blank, a conspicuous void surrounded by carefully detailed terrain. Today, even GPS systems seem to avoid the area, routing drivers around a stretch of wilderness that appears to exist in a technological dead zone. The silence surrounding this place isn't accidental. It's the result of a deliberate collective amnesia, a community-wide agreement to forget what happened there between 1847 and 1889. But forgetting and erasing are two different things, and despite decades of official silence, the evidence remains scattered throughout county records, family Bibles, and the whispered confessions of elderly residents who remember when their grandparents still spoke of the Thornfield curse, what transformed this fertile valley into a place so haunted that even the most hardened mountain folk cross themselves when forced to speak of it. The answer lies with a single family whose arrival in 1847 marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing chapters in Appalachian history. The Whitmore clan didn't just settle in Thornfield Valley, they consumed it, transforming a thriving community of 43 families into something that defies easy categorization. By the time federal investigators arrived in 1889, they found not a ghost town, but something far more unsettling. A valley where the very concept of natural death had been systematically perverted. The Whitmores weren't ordinary settlers. They arrived from the mountains of Western Virginia, carrying with them practices that predated European colonization, rituals that seemed to draw from sources older than Christianity itself. Led by patriarch Ezekiel Whitmore, the family claimed they were fleeing religious persecution, but the nature of their beliefs became apparent only after they had established themselves among the unsuspecting residents of Thornfield Valley. What began as neighborly cooperation gradually evolved into something far more sinister as the Whitmores revealed their true purpose. They weren't seeking refuge in the valley, they were claiming it. The first sign that something was wrong came in the winter of 1848, barely a year after the Whitmores' arrival. That season saw an unprecedented number of deaths among the valley's livestock. Cattle would be found in the morning, standing perfectly still in their fields, eyes open but lifeless, with no visible wounds or signs of disease. Horses would simply stop moving mid-stride, as if some invisible force had drained them of their will to live. The local veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Hendricks, documented these incidents in his journal with growing alarm, noting that the animals showed no signs of illness, but appeared to have died of what he could only describe as profound exhaustion. More disturbing than the livestock deaths were the changes observed in the surviving animals. Chickens that had previously laid eggs regularly stopped producing entirely. Hunting dogs that had been reliable companions for years began cowering at the mention of certain areas of the valley. Most unnervingly, wild animals seemed to be avoiding the region altogether. Hunters reported that deer trails that had been used for generations suddenly went cold, as if the animals had collectively decided to find new routes around the valley entirely. The human population began experiencing similar phenomena. Children who had been healthy and energetic became listless and withdrawn. Adults complained of persistent fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. Sleep became elusive for many residents, but those who did manage to rest reported vivid dreams of walking through endless corridors beneath the earth, following voices that called to them in languages they didn't recognize. Several families reported that their children had begun sleepwalking, always in the direction of the Whitmore property, and had to be physically restrained from leaving their homes at night. Dr. Hendricks, who served as the valley's only medical practitioner, found himself treating an increasing number of patients for what he termed nervous exhaustion. His journal entries from this period describe symptoms that didn't match any known medical condition. Patients who complained of feeling hollow, as if something essential had been removed from their bodies. They spoke of hearing whispers when no one was around, of seeing movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. Most disturbing of all, they reported feeling watched, not by human eyes, but by something that seemed to observe them from impossible angles, as if the very landscape had developed consciousness. The Whitmores themselves appeared immune to these afflictions. If anything, they seemed to thrive as the rest of the valley weakened. Ezekiel Whitmore, who had arrived as a gaunt man in his 50s, began to appear younger and more vigorous with each passing month. His children, who had initially seemed sickly and malnourished, developed an unsettling vitality that set them apart from their increasingly frail neighbors. They grew taller and stronger, while the other children in the valley became pale and withdrawn. By 1850, the demographic shift had become impossible to ignore. The Whitmore family, which had numbered only 7 members upon their arrival, had somehow expanded to include dozens of relatives who appeared without explanation. These new arrivals all shared the same distinctive features: unusually tall frames, pale skin that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and eyes that appeared black in all lighting conditions. They moved with an unnatural synchronicity, as if choreographed by some invisible conductor, and spoke in voices that carried farther than they should have been able to reach. The established families of the valley found themselves increasingly isolated as the Whitmores and their mysterious relatives began to dominate local commerce and social interactions. The family had apparently brought with them considerable wealth, though no one could determine its source. They purchased land at prices that local farmers couldn't refuse, often offering payment in gold coins that bore no recognizable mint marks. Within 3 years of their arrival, the Whitmores owned nearly half the valley, and their influence extended far beyond their property lines. It was during this period of expansion that the first human deaths began occurring. Unlike the livestock deaths, these were not sudden or mysterious. Instead, they followed a pattern that Dr. Hendricks documented with growing horror. Residents would begin experiencing what he initially diagnosed as melancholia, a profound sadness that seemed to have no identifiable cause. This depression would deepen over the course of weeks or months, accompanied by physical symptoms that defied medical explanation. Patients would lose weight despite eating normally, develop a gray pallor that suggested poor circulation, and complain of feeling cold even in warm weather. The final stage of this decline was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what came to be known as the Thornfield wasting. Patients would begin to speak of feeling summoned, as if some irresistible force were calling them to fulfill an obligation they couldn't quite remember making. They would become obsessed with walking to specific locations within the valley, always at night, always alone. Family members who attempted to prevent these nocturnal journeys reported that their loved ones would fight with unexpected strength, their personalities completely transformed by an urgent need to reach their mysterious destination. Those who completed these night walks rarely returned home. When they did, they were fundamentally changed. Dr. Hendricks documented case after case of individuals who had undergone what he could only describe as a spiritual transformation. They spoke differently, moved differently, and seemed to possess knowledge they had never acquired through normal means. Most disturbing of all, they began to exhibit the same physical characteristics as the Whitmores. The unusual height, the light-absorbing skin, and the black eyes that seemed to reflect no light whatsoever. The transformation wasn't limited to physical appearance. These changed individuals began to demonstrate abilities that challenged conventional understanding of human limitations. They could navigate the valley's treacherous terrain in complete darkness, as if they possessed some form of supernatural sight. They seemed to know things about their neighbors that they had no way of learning through normal observation. Most unnervingly, they appeared to be able to communicate with each other without speaking, coordinating their activities through some form of silent understanding. By 1855, the original population of Thornfield Valley had been reduced by more than half. Some families had fled the region entirely, abandoning homes and property that had been in their families for generations. Others had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace except for houses that remained perfectly preserved, as if their occupants had simply ceased to exist mid-activity. Meals were found, still sitting on tables, beds remained unmade, and personal belongings were left exactly where they had been placed, creating an eerie impression of lives interrupted rather than concluded. The survivors found themselves living in a community that bore little resemblance to the place they had once called home. The Whitmores and their ever-expanding family had transformed the valley into something that operated according to different rules than the outside world. Time seemed to move differently there, with seasons that lasted longer or shorter than they should have, and days that felt either endlessly extended or unnaturally brief. The very geography of the valley appeared to be shifting, with familiar landmarks disappearing and new formations emerging overnight. Dr. Hendricks continued to document these changes until his own disappearance in 1856. His final journal entry, discovered years later hidden in the wall of his abandoned office, described his growing realization that the Whitmores weren't simply a family with unusual customs. They were something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic human behavior while pursuing an agenda that remained hidden from their neighbors. His last written words were a warning that whoever found his journal should flee the valley immediately and never return, because the Whitmores had achieved something that he could only describe as a form of immortality that required the sacrifice of everyone around them. The federal investigation that eventually brought outside attention to Thornfield Valley wouldn't begin for another 30 years, but by then, the transformation would be complete. The valley that had once supported a thriving community of mountain families had become something else entirely, a place where the boundary between life and death had been deliberately obscured, where the very concept of natural human mortality had been perverted to serve purposes that investigators would struggle to comprehend, much less document in their official reports. The transformation of Thornfield Valley accelerated dramatically following Dr. Hendrix's disappearance. What had begun as subtle changes in the community's fabric evolved into something far more systematic and deliberate. The Whitmores, no longer content with gradual influence, began implementing what survivors would later describe as a methodical harvesting of the valley's remaining population. The process they employed was both sophisticated and terrifying in its efficiency. Rather than simply waiting for residents to succumb to the mysterious wasting illness, the Whitmores began hosting what they called gathering nights, community events that initially appeared to be attempts at maintaining social cohesion during difficult times. These gatherings took place in a large barn that the family had constructed on their property, a structure that seemed impossibly vast given the materials available in the valley. The building's interior was lit by candles that burned with an unusual blue flame, casting shadows that moved independently of the people who created them. Attendance at these gatherings gradually shifted from voluntary to expected to mandatory. The Whitmores possessed an uncanny ability to know which families were considering leaving the valley, and such families would receive visits from members of the clan who would politely but firmly explain the importance of community participation. These visits were always conducted by the transformed former residents, people who had once been neighbors and friends, but now served as extensions of the Whitmore family's will. Their presence was particularly effective because they retained enough of their original personalities to seem familiar while displaying the unmistakable signs of their transformation. The gathering nights themselves followed a pattern that became increasingly ritualistic over time. Residents would arrive at sunset and find themselves arranged in concentric circles around a central area where the Whitmores would conduct what they termed community discussions. These sessions began with seemingly normal conversations about practical matters, crop planning, weather predictions, and local news. However, as the evening progressed, the discussions would gradually shift toward more esoteric topics: the nature of existence, the relationship between the living and the dead, and the possibility of transcending human limitations. Ezekiel Whitmore served as the primary speaker during these gatherings, and witnesses reported that his voice possessed qualities that made it impossible to ignore. He spoke with an authority that seemed to bypass rational thought, addressing concerns that residents hadn't realized they possessed and offering solutions that felt both logical and deeply unsettling. His words carried a hypnotic quality that made dissent feel not just impossible, but somehow inappropriate, as if questioning his statements would violate some fundamental principle of social order. The content of these discussions was carefully structured to gradually introduce concepts that would have been immediately rejected under normal circumstances. Whitmore spoke of death not as an ending, but as a transition to a more perfected state of being. He described the human body as a temporary vessel that could be improved through proper understanding and dedication. Most significantly, he presented the idea that individual consciousness was less important than collective purpose, suggesting that personal desires and fears were obstacles to achieving true fulfillment. These philosophical discussions were accompanied by practical demonstrations that seemed to validate Whitmore's claims. The transformed residents would display abilities that defied normal human limitations, lifting weights that should have been impossible to move, demonstrating perfect recall of conversations that had taken place years earlier, and showing an intuitive understanding of complex problems that had previously baffled the community's most educated members. These demonstrations were presented not as supernatural phenomena, but as natural results of embracing the principles that Whitmore advocated. The psychological impact of these gatherings was profound and cumulative. Residents found themselves looking forward to the events, despite their growing unease about what they witnessed there. The social isolation that had developed throughout the valley made the gatherings one of the few remaining sources of community interaction, and the Whitmores skillfully exploited this need for connection. They created an atmosphere where participation felt both rewarding and necessary, while abstinence seemed to lead to further isolation and decline. Children were particularly susceptible to the influence of these gatherings. The Whitmores paid special attention to the valley's younger residents, incorporating activities that seemed designed specifically for their entertainment and education. These activities included storytelling sessions where traditional folk tales were modified to include themes of transformation and transcendence, games that required participants to demonstrate trust by following instructions without question, and educational exercises that taught children to recognize and interpret signs that adults couldn't perceive. The most disturbing aspect of the children's involvement was their apparent eagerness to participate. While adults struggled with growing feelings of unease about the gatherings, children seemed to thrive in the environment that the Whitmores created. They displayed increased confidence, improved problem-solving abilities, and a sophisticated understanding of concepts that should have been beyond their developmental level. However, these improvements came at a cost that became apparent only to the adults who observed them most closely. Parents began reporting that their children seemed to be developing dual personalities. During daylight hours, they behaved normally, displaying the expected levels of curiosity, playfulness, and occasional defiance that characterized healthy child development. However, as evening approached, particularly on nights when gatherings were scheduled, these same children would become unnaturally focused and mature, speaking with vocabulary and concepts that they had never been taught, and demonstrating knowledge of events and people that they had never encountered. The transformation process that affected adults was accelerated in children who seemed to possess fewer psychological barriers to the changes that the Whitmores were implementing. Young people who had been energetic and independent began displaying the same synchronized behavior patterns that characterized the Whitmore family members. They moved with identical gestures, responded to questions with remarkably similar phrasing, and began to demonstrate the same unsettling ability to communicate without speaking that had been observed in the transformed adults. By 1860, the distinction between the original Whitmore family and the valley's other residents had become increasingly meaningless. The transformation process had created a population that shared common characteristics regardless of their origins, and the community had evolved into something that operated according to principles that outsiders would have found incomprehensible. The valley had developed its own internal logic, its own social structures, and its own definition of what constituted normal human behavior. The few remaining untransformed residents found themselves living in a community where they were increasingly isolated and irrelevant. Their resistance to the changes occurring around them made them objects of patient but persistent attention from the transformed population, who seemed to view their reluctance as a temporary obstacle rather than a fundamental rejection of the community's evolution. These holdouts were subjected to constant social pressure, economic manipulation, and psychological intimidation, designed to wear down their resistance and encourage their voluntary participation in the transformation process. The methods used to convince these final holdouts were sophisticated and personalized. The transformed residents possessed detailed knowledge of their neighbors' fears, desires, and psychological vulnerabilities, and they used this information to craft approaches that were specifically designed to overcome individual resistance. They offered solutions to long-standing problems, provided comfort during times of grief or stress, and demonstrated consistent reliability in ways that made their transformed state seem not just acceptable, but desirable. The economic pressure was particularly effective because the transformed population had gained control of most of the valley's resources and infrastructure. They operated the mills, managed the stores, and controlled access to the outside world. Families who resisted transformation found themselves increasingly unable to obtain necessary supplies, sell their crops, or maintain their property. The isolation was both physical and social, creating conditions where cooperation with the transformed population became a matter of survival rather than choice. The psychological pressure was even more insidious because it was delivered by people who had once been trusted friends and family members. The transformed residents retained enough of their original personalities to seem familiar and caring, but their priorities had been fundamentally altered. They spoke with genuine concern about their neighbors' well-being, while simultaneously working to undermine their independence and self-determination. They offered help and support while gradually creating dependency relationships that made resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. The final phase of the valley's transformation began in 1865, when the last of the holdout families finally succumbed to the pressure and agreed to participate in what the Whitmores called the final gathering. This event was different from the regular community meetings that had been occurring for years. It was presented as a celebration of unity and completion, a recognition that the valley had achieved something unprecedented in human history. The preparation for this gathering involved elaborate rituals and ceremonies that had been building toward this moment for nearly 2 decades. The final gathering took place over the course of 3 days and nights, during which the entire population of the valley participated in activities that would have been unrecognizable to outside observers. The event marked the completion of the Whitmore's project and the beginning of a new phase in the valley's existence, one that would ultimately attract the attention of federal investigators and lead to the official documentation of what had occurred in Thornfield Valley. The final gathering represented the culmination of everything the Whitmores had been working toward since their arrival in Thornfield Valley. Unlike the regular community meetings that had gradually conditioned residents to accept increasingly strange practices, this event was designed to complete the transformation process permanently and irrevocably. The preparation alone required months of careful coordination, with every detail orchestrated to ensure maximum psychological and spiritual impact on the participants. The Whitmores had constructed a series of underground chambers beneath their property, excavated by the transformed residents who worked with an efficiency that suggested they were following predetermined blueprints rather than improvising as they went. These subterranean spaces were connected by tunnels that formed a complex geometric pattern when viewed from above, creating a design that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere practicality. The chambers themselves were lined with stones that had been quarried from specific locations throughout the valley, each piece selected according to criteria that remained mysterious to outside observers. The walls of these underground spaces were covered with symbols that combined elements from various religious and occult traditions, but arranged in ways that suggested entirely new meanings. These markings appeared to have been carved rather than painted, with a precision that indicated the use of specialized tools. The symbols were filled with a substance that gleamed in candlelight but appeared dark in normal illumination, creating an effect that made the walls seem to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The 3-day event began with what the Whitmores called the preparation phase, during which participants were required to fast and engage in purification rituals that involved bathing in water that had been collected from specific springs throughout the valley. This water had been stored in containers made from materials that the family had brought with them from Virginia, vessels that seemed to preserve the liquid's properties in ways that defied normal understanding of preservation techniques. During the fasting period, participants reported experiencing vivid hallucinations that seemed to be shared among multiple individuals. These visions depicted scenes from the valley's history, but not as it had actually occurred. Instead, they showed an alternative version of events, in which the arrival of the Whitmores had been predetermined and welcomed by the original residents. The hallucinations presented the transformation process as a natural evolution rather than an imposed change, suggesting that the valley's inhabitants had always been destined to become something beyond ordinary humanity. The second phase of the gathering involved what the Whitmores termed the sharing, during which participants were arranged in the underground chambers according to family groups and age categories. Each group was assigned to a specific chamber, and the arrangement seemed to follow a pattern that had been carefully planned to maximize the psychological impact of the experience. Family members were separated in ways that created anxiety and uncertainty, while strangers were grouped together in configurations that forced them to depend on each other for comfort and support. Within each chamber, participants engaged in activities that blurred the boundaries between religious ritual and psychological conditioning. They recited phrases in language that none of them had previously known, performed synchronized movements that seemed to have been choreographed by some invisible director, and participated in ceremonies that involved the consumption of substances that had been prepared according to recipes that the Whitmores claimed predated human civilization. The effects of these substances were profound and lasting. Participants reported experiencing a dissolution of individual identity that was both terrifying and liberating. They described feeling their consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of their physical bodies, merging with something vast and ancient that seemed to exist both within and beyond the valley itself. During these experiences, they claimed to have gained access to knowledge and abilities that were impossible under normal circumstances, including the ability to communicate telepathically with other participants and to perceive events occurring in distant locations. The transformation that occurred during the sharing phase was more complete and permanent than anything that had been achieved during the regular gatherings. Participants emerged from the chambers fundamentally altered, not just in their physical appearance, but in their basic understanding of reality. They spoke of having been awakened to truths that had been hidden from ordinary humans, of having gained access to powers that had been dormant within them since birth, and of having become part of something larger and more significant than individual existence. The physical changes were immediately apparent to anyone who observed the participants after their emergence from the chambers. They displayed the same characteristics that had been noted in the earlier transformed residents, but magnified to an extreme degree. Their height increased dramatically. Their skin took on the light-absorbing quality that had become the hallmark of the Whitmore family, and their eyes became completely black, reflecting no light whatsoever. More disturbing than these visible changes were the alterations in their behavior and capabilities. The newly transformed residents demonstrated abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitations. They could navigate the valley's terrain in complete darkness with perfect accuracy, as if they possessed some form of supernatural sight. They showed no need for sleep, food, or water, yet appeared to grow stronger and more energetic with each passing day. Most unnervingly, they seemed to share a collective consciousness that allowed them to coordinate their activities without any form of verbal communication. The final phase of the gathering was called the binding, and it involved the entire transformed population of the valley participating in a ceremony that lasted from sunset to dawn on the third day. This ritual took place in the largest of the underground chambers, a space that seemed impossibly vast given the dimensions of the structure above ground. The chamber was illuminated by hundreds of candles that burned with the same blue flame that had been observed in the Whitmore barn, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The ceremony itself defied easy description, combining elements of religious worship, theatrical performance, and scientific experimentation. Participants arranged themselves in complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change according to some predetermined sequence. They chanted in unison, their voices creating harmonies that produced physical vibrations in the chamber walls. The sound was described by later investigators as being felt rather than heard, penetrating the bones and organs of anyone who experienced it. At the center of the chamber, Ezekiel Whitmore conducted what appeared to be a summoning ritual, using implements that seemed to have been crafted from materials that weren't entirely natural. These tools included staffs made from wood that appeared to be alive, vessels carved from stones that seemed to generate their own light, and blades forged from metal that maintained a constant temperature regardless of environmental conditions. The purpose of these implements became clear as the ceremony progressed and their effects on the participants became apparent. The binding ceremony was designed to create a permanent connection between the transformed residents and something that existed beyond normal human perception. Participants described feeling themselves being drawn into a relationship with entities that they couldn't see but could sense with perfect clarity. These beings were described as ancient, beyond human comprehension, possessing knowledge and power that dwarfed anything that mortal minds could conceive. The connection established during the ceremony allowed the transformed residents to access this knowledge and power, but at a cost that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The immediate effects of the binding were extraordinary. The transformed population of Thornfield Valley gained abilities that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics and biology. They could manipulate matter at a molecular level, altering the properties of objects through concentrated mental effort. They demonstrated perfect recall of events that had occurred before their birth, as if they had gained access to some form of ancestral memory. Most significantly, they appeared to have achieved a form of immortality that was both physical and spiritual. The valley itself began to change in response to the completed transformation of its human population. The landscape took on characteristics that defied normal geological processes, with rock formations that seemed to grow and shift according to the will of the transformed residents. Water sources appeared and disappeared according to needs that weren't immediately apparent to outside observers. The very atmosphere of the valley became charged with energy that could be felt by anyone who entered the region, creating an environment that was simultaneously beautiful and profoundly unsettling. Wildlife returned to the valley, but in forms that were subtly different from their counterparts in the surrounding region. Animals displayed unusual intelligence and behavior patterns, seeming to serve the transformed population in ways that suggested a level of cooperation that went beyond normal domestication. Birds carried messages between distant locations with perfect accuracy. Predators hunted according to schedules that seemed to be coordinated with human activities, and even insects appeared to follow complex behavioral patterns that served purposes beyond their own survival. The agricultural productivity of the valley increased dramatically following the completion of the transformation process. Crops grew with unprecedented vigor and yield, producing harvests that seemed to defy the limitations of soil, climate, and season. The transformed residents demonstrated an intuitive understanding of agricultural techniques that had never been documented in any farming manual, employing methods that seemed to work with natural forces rather than against them. The results were so impressive that they began to attract attention from outside the valley, leading to inquiries that would eventually bring federal investigators to the region. The social structure that emerged following the final gathering was unlike anything that had been observed in human communities. The transformed residents operated as a collective entity while maintaining individual personalities and capabilities. They made decisions through a process that seemed to involve instantaneous communication and consensus building, reaching agreements on complex issues without any apparent discussion or debate. Their society functioned with perfect efficiency, eliminating waste, conflict, and inefficiency through methods that outside observers would struggle to understand. The economic system that developed in the valley was equally unusual. The transformed residents had no use for traditional currency or barter systems, instead operating according to principles that seemed to be based on need, capability, and collective benefit. They produced goods and services not for profit, but for the advancement of their community's goals, whatever those might be. The quality of their works was extraordinary, with craftsmanship that exceeded anything that had been produced in the region before their transformation. The cultural practices that emerged during this period were both fascinating and disturbing to outside observers. The transformed residents developed art forms that seemed to capture and express concepts that couldn't be communicated through normal human language. Their music produced effects that went beyond aesthetic pleasure, creating emotional and psychological responses that suggested the use of frequencies and harmonies that affected human consciousness in ways that weren't entirely understood. Their visual arts incorporated elements that seemed to move and change when observed from different angles, creating works that appeared to be alive in ways that challenged conventional understanding of artistic media. The religious practices of the transformed community were perhaps the most alien aspect of their new society. They worshipped entities that they claimed existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, conducting ceremonies that seemed to maintain and strengthen their connection to these beings. The rituals involved practices that would have been considered abhorrent by conventional standards, but which the transformed residents regarded as necessary for maintaining their enhanced abilities and extended lifespans. The children born in the valley after the final gathering were unlike any that had been observed in human communities. They displayed adult-level intelligence from birth, communicating through methods that didn't require speech and demonstrating abilities that suggested they had inherited the enhanced capabilities of their transformed parents. These children grew rapidly, reaching physical maturity within a few years, while developing mental and spiritual capabilities that exceeded those of their parents. They seemed to represent the next stage in whatever evolutionary process the Whitmores had initiated. The relationship between the transformed community and the outside world became increasingly complex as word of their unusual capabilities began to spread. Traders who visited the valley reported extraordinary experiences that they struggled to explain to their colleagues. Government officials who attempted to conduct routine administrative business found themselves dealing with individuals who seemed to possess knowledge of events and policies that hadn't been made public. Religious leaders who visited the valley returned with accounts of spiritual experiences that challenged their fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality. The federal investigation that would eventually document the transformation of Thornfield Valley was triggered by reports from multiple sources who had observed phenomena that couldn't be explained through normal means. Military personnel reported unusual activity in the region, including lights and sounds that didn't correspond to any known natural or human-made sources. Scientists who studied geological samples from the valley found mineral compositions that didn't match anything in their reference materials. Most significantly, census workers who attempted to conduct routine population counts found themselves unable to complete their assigned tasks, reporting that the valley's residents seemed to exist in ways that defied normal documentation methods. The investigation that began in 1889 would reveal the full scope of what had occurred in Thornfield Valley, but by then, the transformation was complete and irreversible. The valley had become something that existed outside normal human society, a place where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural had been permanently altered. The federal agents who entered the valley found themselves confronting evidence of human potential that challenged everything they thought they knew about the limitations of mortal existence. But they also discovered the terrible price that had been paid to achieve these capabilities. The federal investigation team that arrived in Thornfield Valley in September of 1889 was led by Captain Marcus Thorne, a Civil War veteran who had been specifically chosen for his experience in dealing with unconventional situations. The team consisted of 12 agents from various government departments, including representatives from the War Department, the Treasury, and the newly formed Bureau of Investigation. They had been briefed on the reports they would be investigating, but nothing in their preparation had adequately prepared them for what they would encounter in the valley. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came when the team attempted to establish their base camp at the valley's entrance. Their horses, which had been reliable throughout the journey from the nearest town, became increasingly agitated as they approached the valley floor. The animals refused to proceed beyond a certain point, rearing and backing away from an invisible barrier that seemed to exist in the air itself. The team was forced to continue on foot, leaving their mounts with local guides who warned them not to venture too far into the valley after dark. As they descended into the valley proper, the investigators began to notice subtle changes in their environment that became more pronounced with each step. The air itself seemed denser, charged with an energy that made their skin tingle and their hair stand on end. The sounds of their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the valley were somehow amplifying and distorting the noise they made. Most disturbing of all, they began to feel watched by unseen observers who seemed to track their movements with perfect precision. The landscape they encountered defied their expectations based on the reports they had reviewed. Rather than finding an abandoned settlement or a community in decline, they discovered a valley that was thriving in ways that seemed impossible given the isolation and the disturbing accounts they had been investigating. The fields were lush and productive, the buildings were well maintained and showed signs of recent construction, and the infrastructure appeared to be more advanced than anything they had encountered in similar rural communities. The first direct contact with the valley's residents occurred on their second day of investigation. Captain Thorne was examining what appeared to be a communal garden when he was approached by a tall figure who moved with the fluid grace of someone half his apparent age. The individual introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, a name that appeared on the original settlement records as one of the valley's founding families. However, the man who stood before Captain Thorne bore little resemblance to what a descendant of Irish immigrants should have looked like. Brennan's appearance was striking in ways that immediately captured the captain's attention. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with proportions that seemed perfectly balanced, despite his unusual height. His skin had a translucent quality that made it appear to glow with internal light, and his eyes were completely black, reflecting no light whatsoever. When he spoke, his voice carried qualities that made it impossible to ignore, resonating with harmonics that seemed to reach directly into the listener's mind. The conversation that followed was both cordial and deeply unsettling. Brennan spoke with knowledge of the investigation team's mission, their backgrounds, and their concerns about the valley's residents. He demonstrated awareness of events that had occurred outside the valley, including recent political developments and military activities that hadn't been made public. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to know details about the investigators' personal lives that they had never shared with anyone. Captain Thorne attempted to conduct a formal interview, but found that his usual techniques were ineffective against someone who seemed to anticipate his questions before they were asked. Brennan answered queries that hadn't been voiced, provided information that hadn't been requested, and demonstrated a level of cooperation that was somehow more unsettling than outright resistance would have been. He offered to provide a complete tour of the valley and access to any records the investigators might want to examine, but his manner suggested that he already knew what they would find. The tour that followed revealed a community that operated according to principles that challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about human society. The residents they encountered displayed the same physical characteristics as Brennan, but with variations that suggested they had been transformed at different times or through different processes. Some retained more of their original human appearance, while others had been changed so completely that their original identities were impossible to determine. The work being performed by the valley's residents was unlike anything the investigators had observed in other communities. They witnessed individuals manipulating materials with their bare hands in ways that seemed to violate basic physical laws. Stone was shaped as if it were clay, metal was bent and twisted without the use of tools, and wood was carved with precision that exceeded what should have been possible with the most advanced equipment available. The workers moved with perfect coordination, as if they were following instructions that were communicated through means other than speech. The agricultural practices they observed were equally extraordinary. Plants grew in patterns that seemed to defy natural botanical principles, with root systems that formed complex geometric designs and above-ground growth that followed mathematical progressions. The crops produced yields that shouldn't have been possible given the soil conditions and climate, and the harvesting was performed using techniques that seemed to enhance rather than diminish the plant's vitality. The investigators watched workers who appeared to be communicating with the plants themselves, coaxing them to produce specific results through methods that bordered on the supernatural. The social interactions they witnessed were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the valley's transformed society. The residents moved and acted with a synchronicity that suggested they were following a shared consciousness rather than individual decision-making processes. Conversations occurred without words, with participants responding to thoughts and emotions that hadn't been verbally expressed. Children played games that seemed to involve manipulating reality itself, creating effects that the investigators couldn't explain through normal physical processes. The investigators attempted to document what they were observing, but found that their equipment functioned unreliably within the valley. Cameras produced images that showed different scenes than what the operators had witnessed. Measuring devices provided readings that fluctuated wildly without apparent cause, and written notes seemed to change when they weren't being directly observed. The team began to suspect that the valley itself was somehow interfering with their ability to record evidence of what they were experiencing. The evening of their third day in the valley marked a turning point in the investigation. The team had been invited to attend what the residents called a community reflection, which they described as a regular gathering for sharing experiences and making collective decisions. The investigators accepted the invitation, hoping to gain insight into the social structure and decision-making processes of the transformed community. The gathering took place in the same underground chamber complex that had been used for the final gathering years earlier. The investigators were led through tunnels that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible given the surface geography of the valley. The passages were lit by the same blue flames that had been observed in earlier reports, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The chamber they entered was vast beyond anything they had expected, with walls that seemed to extend upward into darkness and floor space that could have accommodated hundreds of participants. The geometric patterns carved into the walls appeared to shift and change as they were observed, creating an optical illusion that made it difficult to focus on any single element for extended periods. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy that the investigators could feel in their bones. The community reflection that followed was unlike any social gathering the investigators had ever witnessed. The participants arranged themselves in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles, with each individual positioned according to criteria that weren't immediately apparent. The activities that took place involved synchronized movements, harmonized vocalizations, and what appeared to be collective meditation that produced visible effects in the chamber's atmosphere. During the gathering, the investigators observed phenomena that challenged their understanding of human capabilities. Participants seemed to share thoughts and emotions instantaneously, responding to stimuli that weren't perceptible to outside observers. They demonstrated abilities that appeared to violate physical laws, including the manipulation of objects without physical contact and the creation of light and sound through mental concentration alone. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to be drawing energy from sources that existed beyond normal human perception. The psychological impact of witnessing these events was profound and lasting. Several members of the investigation team reported experiencing disorientation and confusion that persisted long after the gathering had ended. They described feeling as if their understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered, as if they had been exposed to truths that their minds weren't equipped to process. Some reported having vivid dreams that seemed to continue the experiences they had witnessed in the chamber, while others found themselves unable to sleep at all. Captain Thorne himself was deeply affected by what he had observed. His official reports, which were classified immediately upon submission, described events that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of normal human experience. He wrote of encountering a form of human evolution that had been achieved through methods that were both fascinating and terrifying in their implications. His recommendations to his superiors were clear. The valley represented a phenomenon that required immediate and intensive study, but also posed potential risks that needed to be carefully managed. The investigation team's attempts to gather physical evidence proved largely unsuccessful. Samples of soil, water, and plant materials that were collected within the valley underwent changes during transport that rendered them useless for analysis. Photographs developed into images that showed scenes different from what had been captured, often depicting events that had occurred at different times or locations. Audio recordings contained sounds and voices that hadn't been present during the original recording sessions, including conversations in languages that couldn't be identified. The most disturbing aspect of the evidence collection efforts was the apparent ability of the Valley's residents to influence the investigation process itself. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, with failures occurring at precisely the moments when the most significant observations were being made. Written notes disappeared from secured containers, only to reappear in locations where they shouldn't have been accessible. Most unnervingly, the investigators began to suspect that their own memories of events were being altered, with details changing or disappearing entirely when they attempted to recall specific incidents. The team's final days in the valley were marked by increasing tension and uncertainty. They found themselves questioning not only what they had observed, but also their own ability to accurately perceive and record events. The residents continued to be cooperative and helpful, but their assistance seemed to be guided by an agenda that wasn't entirely clear. They provided information that was technically accurate, but somehow incomplete, answered questions in ways that raised more concerns than they resolved, and demonstrated a level of knowledge about the investigation's purpose that suggested they had access to information that should have been classified. The departure from the valley was as difficult as the arrival had been. The investigation team found that their memories of specific events became increasingly vague as they moved away from the valley floor. Details that had seemed crystal clear during their stay became fuzzy and uncertain once they reached the outside world. The physical evidence they had attempted to collect continued to deteriorate, with samples becoming unrecognizable and equipment showing signs of damage that couldn't be explained through normal wear and tear. The official report submitted by Captain Thorne was heavily redacted before being filed in government archives that were sealed indefinitely. The portions that remained accessible described a community that had achieved remarkable advances in agriculture, craftsmanship, and social organization, but which operated according to principles that weren't entirely understood by outside observers. The report recommended continued monitoring of the valley, but advised against further direct investigation until better methods for documenting and analyzing the observed phenomena could be developed. The classified sections of the report, which wouldn't be declassified until nearly a century later, contained far more disturbing information. Captain Thorne described evidence of human transformation that went beyond physical appearance to include fundamental changes in consciousness and capability. He documented observations of abilities that seemed to violate natural laws and reported encounters with intelligence that appeared to exist beyond normal human limitations. Most significantly, he warned that the valley's residents possessed knowledge and power that could pose significant risks if it were to spread beyond their isolated community. The investigation team was disbanded immediately upon their return, with members reassigned to different departments and locations to prevent them from comparing their experiences or coordinating their accounts. They were required to sign agreements that prohibited them from discussing their observations with anyone outside of designated government channels, and their personnel files were flagged to ensure that they would never again be assigned to similar investigations. The psychological impact of the investigation continued to affect the team members for years after their return. Several experienced recurring nightmares that seemed to continue the experiences they had witnessed in the valley. Others reported ongoing difficulties with memory and concentration that interfered with their ability to perform their regular duties. Most disturbing of all, some began to display subtle changes in their behavior and capabilities that suggested they had been influenced by their exposure to the valley's transformed residents. The government's response to the investigation was swift and comprehensive. The valley was officially designated as a restricted area, with access limited to authorized personnel only. Maps were modified to obscure the valley's location, and local residents were discouraged from discussing the area through a combination of economic incentives and subtle intimidation. The official explanation for these measures was that the valley contained sensitive military installations that required protection from foreign interference. The restriction of access to the valley was enforced through a combination of legal and practical measures. Roads leading to the area were closed or rerouted, surveying markers were removed or relocated, and property records were modified to create confusion about land ownership and boundaries. Local law enforcement agencies were instructed to treat any unauthorized entry into the valley as a federal crime, with violators subject to immediate arrest and prosecution under national security statutes. The cover-up was largely successful in preventing public awareness of what had occurred in Thornfield Valley. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the story found themselves facing official obstruction and unofficial pressure that made it impossible to publish their findings. Academics who tried to study the area were denied access to relevant documents and archives, while local residents who had witnessed unusual events were discouraged from sharing their accounts through a combination of legal threats and economic pressure. The transformed residents of the valley seemed to cooperate with the government's efforts to maintain secrecy about their existence. They made no attempts to expand their influence beyond the valley's boundaries, showed no interest in recruiting new members from outside populations, and demonstrated a level of discretion that suggested they understood the need to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Their behavior indicated that they were content to remain isolated as long as their autonomy was respected and their activities weren't interfered with. The arrangement that developed between the government and the valley's residents was informal but effective. The authorities agreed to maintain the valley's isolation and protect it from outside interference, while the residents agreed to limit their activities to their designated territory and avoid actions that might expose their existence to the general public. This understanding was maintained through occasional contacts between government representatives and valley spokespeople, but the details of these communications were kept classified at the highest levels. The long-term consequences of the Thornfield Valley investigation extended far beyond the immediate concerns about the transformed residents. The phenomena observed in the valley challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential and the nature of reality itself, raising questions that government scientists and philosophers would continue to grapple with for decades. The investigation had revealed the existence of capabilities that could potentially revolutionize human civilization, but it had also demonstrated the risks associated with attempting to achieve such transformation. The classified research programs that were established in response to the investigation focused on understanding the methods and mechanisms that had been used to transform the valley's residents. Scientists attempted to replicate the observed phenomena under controlled conditions, hoping to harness the same powers while avoiding the disturbing changes in consciousness and identity that had been documented in the valley. These efforts were largely unsuccessful, suggesting that the transformation process required conditions or knowledge that couldn't be easily reproduced in laboratory settings. The failure of attempts to replicate the valley's transformation led to increased interest in studying the residents themselves. Government scientists proposed establishing a research facility near the valley that would allow for ongoing observation and analysis of the transformed community. However, these proposals were rejected by senior officials who feared that such activities might provoke hostile responses from the valley's residents or attract unwanted attention from foreign governments. The decision to maintain the valley's isolation while continuing to monitor it from a distance became the foundation of a policy that would persist for decades. The government established a network of observation posts around the valley's perimeter, staffed by personnel who were trained to document unusual activities while maintaining strict secrecy about their mission. These observers reported on changes in the valley's population, technology, and behavior patterns, providing a continuous record of the community's evolution over time. The reports generated by these observation posts revealed that the valley's residents continued to develop new capabilities and technologies that exceeded anything available in the outside world. They demonstrated advances in agriculture, engineering, and medicine that suggested access to knowledge sources that weren't available to conventional researchers. Most significantly, they showed no signs of aging or mortality, indicating that they had achieved a form of immortality that was both physical and spiritual in nature. The implications of the valley's continued existence and development were profound and troubling for government officials who were responsible for maintaining national security. The residents possessed knowledge and abilities that could potentially be used to influence or control populations outside the valley, but their intentions regarding the use of such capabilities remained unclear. The government's policy of containment and observation was based on the assumption that the residents would remain content with their isolation, but there was no guarantee that this assumption would prove correct over time. The transformation of Thornfield Valley had created a situation that challenged conventional approaches to governance and national security. The valley's residents existed outside normal legal and social frameworks, yet they posed potential risks that couldn't be ignored. The government's response to this challenge established precedents for dealing with phenomena that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience, creating policies and procedures that would be applied to similar situations in the future. The legacy of the Thornfield Valley investigation would continue to influence government policy and scientific research for generations. The classified documents generated by the investigation became the foundation for ongoing studies of human potential and the nature of consciousness itself. The phenomena observed in the valley provided evidence that reality was far more complex and malleable than had been previously understood, opening new avenues for research, while also highlighting the risks associated with attempting to transcend normal human limitations. The story of Thornfield Valley serves as a reminder that there are aspects of human existence that remain beyond our current understanding and control. The transformation of the valley's residents represents both the promise and the peril of human potential, demonstrating that the boundaries between the natural and supernatural may be far more permeable than we have traditionally believed. The government's response to this discovery reflects the challenges faced by institutions that must balance the pursuit of knowledge with the need to maintain social stability and security. The valley remains restricted to this day, its secrets protected by layers of classification and misdirection that have proven remarkably effective in preventing public awareness of what occurred there. The transformed residents continue their existence in isolation, their activities monitored but not interfered with, their knowledge and abilities both coveted and feared by those who are aware of their existence. The balance between containment and study that was established in the aftermath of the 1889 investigation continues to guide official policy, but the fundamental questions raised by the valley's transformation remain unanswered. The transformation of Thornfield Valley stands as one of the most significant and disturbing events in the hidden history of human development. It represents a chapter in our species' story that challenges everything we think we know about the limitations of human potential and the nature of reality itself. The valley's residents achieved something that had been considered impossible, but at a cost that raises profound questions about the price of transcendence and the wisdom of attempting to exceed the boundaries that define human existence. The decades following the official classification of Thornfield Valley as a restricted zone saw the establishment of what government documents referred to as Project Observation, a comprehensive surveillance program designed to monitor the transformed residents while maintaining absolute secrecy about their existence. The program operated under the cover of a geological survey station, with personnel rotating through assignments that few understood the true nature of. Those selected for this duty underwent extensive psychological evaluation and were required to sign agreements that bound them to silence for the remainder of their lives. The observation posts established around the valley's perimeter were marvels of concealment, built into natural rock formations and camouflaged with vegetation that made them virtually invisible to casual observation. Each post was equipped with specialized instruments designed to detect and record phenomena that conventional equipment couldn't measure. The technology employed was decades ahead of what was available to civilian researchers, developed specifically to study the unique properties that emanated from the valley's interior. The data collected by these observation posts revealed patterns of activity that defied conventional understanding of human behavior and community organization. The valley's residents operated according to schedules that seemed to be coordinated with astronomical events, solar cycles, and planetary alignments that had no apparent connection to practical concerns. Their movement followed mathematical patterns that suggested they were responding to forces or signals that existed beyond normal human perception. Most disturbing to the observers was the evidence of continued evolution among the valley's residents. The physical transformations that had been documented during the 1889 investigation appeared to be ongoing, with individuals displaying new characteristics and capabilities that hadn't been present during earlier observations. Some residents began to exhibit what could only be described as photosynthetic properties, seeming to derive energy directly from sunlight rather than consuming traditional food sources. Others developed what appeared to be magnetic sensitivity, moving in response to electromagnetic fields that were too weak to be detected by conventional instruments. The children born in the valley after the federal investigation represented a new phase in whatever evolutionary process the community had undergone. These individuals displayed capabilities that exceeded even their transformed parents, demonstrating abilities that seemed to violate fundamental physical laws. They could manipulate matter at the molecular level, creating changes in the chemical composition of materials through concentrated mental effort. They showed no need for sleep or rest, maintaining constant activity levels that would have been impossible for ordinary humans to sustain. The social structure of the valley continued to evolve in ways that reflected the enhanced capabilities of its residents. The community operated as a collective consciousness while maintaining individual personalities and specialized roles. Decision-making processes occurred through methods that involved instantaneous communication and consensus building that transcended the limitations of verbal language. The residents seemed to share not only thoughts and emotions, but also memories and experiences, creating a form of communal identity that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling to outside observers. The agricultural practices developed by the valley's residents represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of their enhanced abilities. They cultivated crops that didn't exist in nature, creating hybrid species that combined characteristics from multiple plant families in ways that should have been genetically impossible. These plants grew with unprecedented speed and yield, producing harvests that seemed to be designed to meet specific nutritional and chemical requirements rather than following natural botanical patterns. The construction projects undertaken by the valley's residents demonstrated engineering capabilities that exceeded anything available to contemporary civilization. They built structures that seemed to defy gravity, creating buildings that appeared to float above their foundations without visible means of support. The materials they used were unlike anything found in conventional construction, exhibiting properties that suggested they had been altered at the atomic level to possess characteristics that normal materials couldn't achieve. The energy systems developed by the valley's residents operated according to principles that weren't understood by outside observers. They generated power through methods that seemed to tap into sources that existed beyond conventional physics, creating electrical and thermal energy without any apparent fuel source. The technology they employed was both advanced and alien, incorporating elements that suggested they had access to knowledge that hadn't been developed through normal scientific processes. The cultural expressions that emerged from the valley's transformed society reflected their enhanced consciousness and expanded perception of reality. They created art forms that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with visual works that appeared different when viewed from various angles or at different times. Their music produced effects that went beyond aesthetic appreciation, creating psychological and physiological responses that suggested the use of frequencies and harmonics that affected human consciousness in ways that weren't fully understood. The religious practices of the valley's residents continued to evolve in directions that reflected their ongoing transformation. They worshipped entities that they claimed existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, conducting ceremonies that seemed to maintain and strengthen their connection to these beings. The rituals involved practices that incorporated elements from multiple belief systems while adding components that were entirely unique to their transformed state. The relationship between the valley's residents and the natural world around them had been fundamentally altered by their transformation. They seemed to exist in perfect harmony with their environment, manipulating natural processes in ways that enhanced rather than disrupted ecological balance. Wildlife in the valley displayed behavior patterns that suggested they were responding to directions or influences from the human population, creating a form of interspecies cooperation that exceeded anything observed in normal environments. The economic system that had developed within the valley operated according to principles that eliminated the traditional concepts of scarcity and competition. The residents produced goods and services not for personal gain, but for the advancement of collective goals that weren't entirely clear to outside observers. Their work was characterized by a level of quality and efficiency that suggested they had access to knowledge and techniques that weren't available through conventional means. The medical practices employed by the valley's residents demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human physiology and the nature of disease. They seemed to be immune to most forms of illness, with healing processes that operated far more rapidly and effectively than anything observed in normal human populations. When injuries did occur, they were repaired through methods that appeared to involve the regeneration of damaged tissue at the cellular level. The educational systems developed for the valley's children reflected their enhanced cognitive abilities and expanded consciousness. Learning occurred through methods that seemed to involve direct transfer of knowledge and experience rather than traditional instruction. Children mastered complex concepts and skills at rates that would have been impossible for ordinary humans, demonstrating understanding that exceeded what should have been possible given their chronological age. The communication systems used by the valley's residents had evolved far beyond conventional language. They exchanged information through methods that involved telepathic transmission, emotional resonance, and what appeared to be direct sharing of consciousness. Their ability to coordinate complex activities without verbal communication suggested they had developed forms of collective intelligence that operated according to principles that weren't understood by outside observers. The technological developments that emerged from the valley reflected capabilities that seemed to be decades or even centuries ahead of contemporary civilization. They created devices that operated according to principles that weren't recognized by conventional science, employing materials and energy sources that didn't exist in the outside world. The applications of this technology were both practical and mysterious, serving purposes that weren't immediately apparent to observers. The psychological profiles of the valley's residents revealed consciousness that had been expanded far beyond normal human limitations. They displayed awareness of events and phenomena that existed beyond their immediate physical environment, seeming to possess knowledge of distant locations and future occurrences that they had no normal means of acquiring. Their emotional responses were both more intense and more controlled than those of ordinary humans, suggesting they had achieved a form of psychological balance that transcended normal human experience. The security measures that had been implemented to protect the valley's secrets became increasingly sophisticated as the years passed. The government developed new technologies and procedures specifically designed to monitor and contain phenomena that existed beyond normal understanding. The personnel assigned to these duties were selected for their ability to observe and document extraordinary events while maintaining the psychological stability necessary to function in highly classified environments. The research programs that were established to study the valley's phenomena from a distance employed the most advanced scientific methods available to the government. Teams of specialists analyzed the data collected by observation posts, attempting to understand the mechanisms and principles that had enabled the valley's transformation. The results of these studies were classified at the highest levels, with access limited to individuals who had been specifically cleared for exposure to information that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The implications of the valley's continued existence and development were profound for government officials who were responsible for maintaining national security. The residents possessed knowledge and abilities that could potentially revolutionize human civilization, but they also represented a form of existence that was fundamentally different from normal human society. The question of whether their transformation represented evolution or devolution remained a subject of intense debate among classified research communities. The protocols that were established for dealing with similar phenomena in other locations were based on the lessons learned from the Thornfield Valley investigation. Government agencies developed procedures for identifying, containing, and studying anomalous events that might pose risks to national security or public safety. These protocols emphasized the importance of maintaining secrecy while gathering intelligence about phenomena that existed beyond conventional understanding. The international implications of the valley's existence were carefully managed through diplomatic channels that operated at the highest levels of government. Foreign intelligence services were aware that the United States was concealing information about unusual phenomena, but the specific details of the valley's transformation remained classified. The government's policy was to neither confirm nor deny the existence of such phenomena, while maintaining vigilance against attempts by foreign powers to discover or exploit similar capabilities. The scientific community's awareness of the valley's existence was limited to a small number of researchers who had been granted security clearances that allowed them to study classified materials. These individuals were required to conduct their research under strict supervision, with their findings subject to review and censorship before any form of publication or dissemination. The knowledge gained from these studies influenced the development of new theories and technologies, but always within the constraints imposed by national security considerations. The cultural impact of the valley's transformation extended beyond the immediate concerns of government and scientific communities. The existence of the transformed residents challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and potential, raising questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The philosophical implications of their achievements were profound, suggesting that the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena might be far more permeable than had been previously understood. The valley's residents seemed to be aware of the observation and monitoring activities that surrounded their community, but they showed no signs of concern or hostility toward these efforts. Their behavior suggested they understood the need for secrecy and were content to maintain their isolation as long as their autonomy was respected. This cooperative attitude was both reassuring and unsettling to government officials who were responsible for managing the situation. The long-term sustainability of the containment and observation program became a subject of increasing concern as the decades passed. The resources required to maintain secrecy about the valley's existence were substantial, and the risks associated with exposure continued to grow as technology advanced and information became more difficult to control. The government faced the challenge of balancing the need for continued study with the practical limitations of maintaining an indefinite cover-up. The personnel who had been assigned to observe and study the valley over the years developed a unique perspective on the nature of human potential and the possibilities for transformation. Many reported that their exposure to the valley's phenomena had fundamentally altered their understanding of reality and their place within it. Some experienced psychological changes that seemed to parallel in minor ways the transformation that had occurred among the valley's residents. The documentation that accumulated over the decades of observation created an archive of information that was both invaluable and dangerous. The records contained evidence of human capabilities that exceeded anything previously documented, but they also revealed the risks associated with attempting to transcend normal human limitations. The government faced the challenge of preserving this knowledge while preventing its misuse by individuals or organizations that might seek to exploit it for harmful purposes. The valley's transformation had created a situation that existed outside normal legal and social frameworks, requiring the development of new policies and procedures for dealing with phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. The government's response to this challenge established precedents that would influence how similar situations were handled in the future, creating a body of classified knowledge and experience that would prove valuable in dealing with other anomalous events. The story of Thornfield Valley represents one of the most significant and disturbing chapters in the hidden history of human development. The transformation of its residents demonstrated that the boundaries of human potential were far more flexible than had been previously understood, but it also revealed the profound risks associated with attempting to exceed those boundaries. The government's response to this discovery reflected the challenges faced by institutions that must balance the pursuit of knowledge with the need to maintain social stability and security. The valley remains under observation to this day, its secrets protected by layers of classification and misdirection that have proven remarkably effective in preventing public awareness of what occurred there. The transformed residents continue their existence in isolation, their activities monitored but not interfered with, their knowledge and abilities both coveted and feared by those who are aware of their existence. The balance between containment and study that was established in the aftermath of the original investigation continues to guide official policy, but the fundamental questions raised by the valley's transformation remain as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. The final chapter of Thornfield Valley's story remains unwritten, its conclusion hidden behind walls of classification that may never be breached. The transformed residents continue their existence in a state that transcends normal human understanding, their community serving as both a testament to human potential and a warning about the price of transcendence. The government's surveillance apparatus maintains its vigilant watch, documenting changes and developments that occur within the valley, while ensuring that knowledge of these phenomena never reaches the public consciousness. Recent decades have brought new challenges to the containment effort as technology has advanced and information has become increasingly difficult to control. Satellite imagery, internet communications, and civilian GPS systems have made it progressively harder to maintain the geographical obscurity that has protected the valley's secrets for over a century. The government has been forced to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of digital manipulation and information suppression to maintain the illusion that the valley simply doesn't exist. The personnel who currently staff the observation posts represent the latest generation in a long line of individuals who have dedicated their careers to monitoring phenomena that they can never fully understand or discuss. They undergo psychological conditioning that prepares them for exposure to events that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, yet many still struggle with the cognitive dissonance that results from witnessing capabilities that shouldn't be possible. The turnover rate among observation staff remains high, with many requesting transfers to conventional assignments after relatively brief exposure to the valley's mysteries. The data collected by modern surveillance equipment has revealed new developments within the valley that suggest the transformation process is far from complete. The residents continue to evolve in ways that exceed even their previously documented capabilities, displaying abilities that seem to operate according to principles that exist outside known scientific frameworks. They have begun to manipulate space and time in ways that create localized distortions in the fabric of reality itself, generating phenomena that threaten to overwhelm the containment protocols that have been in place for generations. The children born in the valley over the past several decades represent something entirely new in human evolution. These individuals that display capabilities that suggest they exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, their consciousness extending far beyond the physical boundaries of their bodies. They demonstrate perfect awareness of events occurring throughout the world, seeming to possess a form of omniscience that allows them to observe and understand phenomena that are separated by vast distances of space and time. The implications of these developments have created intense debate within the classified research community about whether the valley's residents still represented a form of enhanced humanity or have evolved into something entirely different. Some researchers argue that the transformation has progressed to the point where the valley's inhabitants can no longer be considered human in any meaningful sense, while others maintain that they represent the next stage in human evolution and should be studied as a preview of humanity's potential future. The question of whether the valley's transformation could be replicated elsewhere has become a source of both fascination and terror for government officials. The possibility that similar communities might emerge spontaneously or be deliberately created has led to the establishment of monitoring systems designed to detect early signs of comparable phenomena. These systems scan for unusual patterns in mortality rates, agricultural productivity, and social behavior that might indicate the beginning of a transformation process, similar to what occurred in Thornfield Valley. The international implications of the valley's continued existence have grown more complex as global communications have advanced and foreign intelligence services have become increasingly sophisticated in their information gathering capabilities. Several nations are believed to have developed awareness of unusual phenomena occurring within American territory, though the specific details of the valley's transformation remain classified. The possibility that other countries might be attempting to replicate the valley's transformation has become a source of ongoing concern for national security planners. The scientific community's understanding of the valley's phenomena has advanced considerably since the original investigation, but many fundamental questions remain unanswered. Researchers have developed theoretical frameworks that attempt to explain the observed capabilities in terms of quantum mechanics, dimensional physics, and consciousness studies, but these theories remain largely speculative. The inability to conduct direct experiments or gather physical samples from within the valley has limited the progress of scientific understanding, forcing researchers to rely on remote observation and theoretical modeling. The cultural impact of the valley's existence extends far beyond the immediate concerns of government and scientific communities. The knowledge that human consciousness and capability can be fundamentally altered through unknown processes has influenced philosophical and religious thinking within classified circles. Some scholars have argued that the valley's transformation represents evidence of spiritual dimensions that exist beyond material reality, while others maintain that it demonstrates the purely physical nature of consciousness and the possibility of technological transcendence. The residents of Thornfield Valley seem to be aware of the debates and discussions that their existence has generated within government and scientific circles. They have occasionally communicated with observation personnel through methods that bypass normal surveillance systems, demonstrating awareness of classified research projects and political developments that they should have no means of knowing about. These communications have been cryptic and infrequent, but they suggest that the valley's residents maintain some level of interest in the outside world despite their apparent isolation. The long-term sustainability of the containment effort has become increasingly questionable as the costs of maintaining secrecy have grown and the risks of exposure have multiplied. The government faces the challenge of balancing the need for continued study with the practical limitations of indefinite concealment. Some officials have begun to question whether the time has come to acknowledge the valley's existence and attempt to establish formal diplomatic relations with its transformed residents. The possibility of voluntary contact with the valley's residents has been debated extensively within classified policy circles. Some advocates argue that direct communication might provide valuable insights into the transformation process and its implications for human development. Others warn that such contact could be dangerous, potentially exposing government personnel to influences that might compromise their loyalty or sanity. The valley's residents have shown no interest in expanding their influence beyond their current territory, but there is no guarantee that this restraint would continue if their isolation were voluntarily breached. The documentation that has accumulated over more than a century of observation represents one of the most comprehensive records of anomalous phenomena ever assembled. The archives contain evidence of human capabilities that exceed anything previously documented in scientific literature, but they also reveal the profound risks associated with attempting to transcend normal human limitations. The government faces the challenge of preserving this knowledge while preventing its misuse by individuals or organizations that might seek to exploit it for harmful purposes. The Valley's transformation has created a situation that exists outside normal legal and social frameworks, requiring the development of new policies and procedures for dealing with phenomena that challenge conventional understanding. The government's response to this challenge has established precedents that influence how similar situations are handled, creating a body of classified knowledge and experience that proves valuable in dealing with other anomalous events that periodically emerge throughout the world. The story of Thornfield Valley serves as both inspiration and warning about the nature of human potential and the risks associated with attempting to exceed the boundaries that define normal existence. The transformation of its residents demonstrates that consciousness and capability can be fundamentally altered through processes that remain largely mysterious, but it also reveals the profound costs that such changes might entail. The Valley stands as a testament to the possibility of human transcendence and a reminder that some forms of evolution might carry prices that exceed their benefits. The future of Thornfield Valley remains uncertain, its residents continuing their existence in a state that transcends normal human understanding, while government observers maintain their vigilant watch from the shadows. The knowledge gained from decades of study has advanced human understanding of consciousness and potential, but it has also raised questions that may never be fully answered. The Valley's secrets remain protected by layers of classification that may persist indefinitely, ensuring that its story continues to unfold in darkness, witnessed only by those who have sworn to carry its mysteries to their graves. The transformation of Thornfield Valley represents one of the most significant and disturbing events in the hidden history of human development, a chapter that challenges everything we believe about the nature of existence and the boundaries of human potential. The Valley's residents achieved something that was considered impossible, but at a cost that raises profound questions about the wisdom of transcendence and the price of evolution. Their story continues to unfold in the shadows of government secrecy, a reminder that there are aspects of human existence that remain beyond our current understanding and control, waiting in the darkness of classified archives for a future generation that might be better equipped to comprehend their true significance.